If my son stops breathing before we land, please don't let them leave him alone. Those were the words that would change everything. But 6 hours earlier, Claire Whitmore was just another exhausted mother trying not to fall apart in seat 34B. The steady roar of the aircraft engines filled the cabin as Flight 817 climbed above the California coastline and pointed east toward Boston. 14 hours. 14 hours between fear and hope. 14 hours between the life Claire knew and whatever waited for her on the other side of the country. She tightened her grip around the worn medical folder resting on her lap. Inside were test results, referral letters, and every prayer she had been carrying for the last 8 months. Beside her, 5-year-old Noah curled against the window, his small face pale beneath the dim cabin lights. He looked smaller than a child his age should have looked. Smaller than he had looked a year ago. Claire brushed a hand through his sandy blonde hair and forced a smile when he glanced up at her. "You okay, buddy?" she whispered. Noah nodded, but children had a way of lying when they wanted to protect the people they loved. Claire knew because she had been doing the same thing for months. Around them, passengers settled into the long, overnight flight. Some opened laptops. Others pulled blankets over themselves. A flight attendant moved down the aisle offering drinks. Claire declined. She needed every dollar she had left. $37.12 remained in her checking account. She knew because she had checked 3 times before boarding. Her co-workers at St. Mary's Medical Center had pooled money together to help pay for the flight after learning Boston Children's Hospital had accepted Noah's case. The thought still made her emotional. People who were barely making rent themselves had reached into their own pockets to help her son. The kindness of strangers had become the only thing keeping her standing. Across the aisle, a businessman complained about the overhead bin space. 2 rows ahead, someone laughed at a movie playing through headphones. Life moved normally for everyone else. Claire envied that. For her, every heartbeat felt borrowed. Noah suddenly shifted beside her and winced. The movement was small, almost invisible, but a mother noticed everything. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. He hesitated before giving a tiny nod. Claire's stomach tightened. She reached into her bag and removed his medication. The routine had become automatic. Water. Pill. Gentle smile. Pretend everything would be okay. Noah swallowed and leaned against her shoulder. Within minutes, exhaustion began pulling at him again. The previous week had been filled with hospital visits, paperwork, and sleepless nights. He was tired. Claire was beyond tired. She had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in nearly a year. As Noah drifted toward sleep, Claire allowed herself to look around for the first time. That was when she noticed the man seated beside her. He occupied seat 34A. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark gray suit, expensive watch. The kind of quiet confidence that usually surrounded people who never worried about bills or overdue notices. A closed laptop rested on the tray table in front of him. His eyes remained fixed on a document displayed on his phone. He hadn't spoken since boarding. He hadn't looked at anyone. He carried the invisible wall successful people often carried. Claire lowered her gaze immediately. Their worlds had nothing in common. Yet as turbulence lightly rattled the aircraft and the seatbelt sign illuminated overhead, she didn't notice the brief glance the stranger sent toward Noah. Nor did she notice the concern that flickered across his face before he returned his attention to the glowing screen. At that moment, neither Claire nor Ethan Caldwell had any idea that before this flight ended, one whispered sentence would force him to question every decision he had planned to make the next morning. 3 hours into the flight, most of the cabin had settled into the strange silence that only existed on overnight routes. The overhead lights were dimmed. Window shades were closed. The world beyond the aircraft had disappeared into darkness somewhere above the continent. Claire watched Noah sleep against her shoulder and tried not to think about the clock. Every minute that passed brought them closer to Boston, but it also brought them closer to answers she was terrified to hear. She carefully adjusted the thin airline blanket around her son. His breathing seemed steady now. That should have comforted her. Instead, it made her nervous. Experience had taught her that good moments often disappeared without warning. She glanced at the medical folder resting beneath the seat in front of her. The edges were bent from being carried everywhere. Hospital visits, specialist appointments, insurance appeals. Every page inside represented another battle she had fought alone. A flight attendant pushed a beverage cart quietly down the aisle. When she reached their row, Claire shook her head. She was not hungry. She had not been hungry for weeks. Beside her, Ethan Caldwell finally closed the document he had been reviewing for nearly an hour. He rubbed a hand across his jaw and stared toward the dark cabin. Most people would have seen a successful businessman enjoying a comfortable flight. The reality was different. His phone contained 17 unread messages from executives waiting for his approval. 2 board members were expecting a final decision by morning. A major restructuring plan sat one signature away from becoming permanent. Billions of dollars depended on choices he would make within the next 24 hours. Normally, that kind of responsibility energized him. Tonight it felt unusually heavy. His attention drifted toward Claire and Noah again. The little boy shifted slightly in his sleep. Claire immediately placed a reassuring hand on his back. The movement was automatic, protective, instinctive. Ethan remembered his own mother doing the same thing when he was young. The memory appeared so suddenly that it caught him off guard. He had spent years avoiding thoughts like that. Work was easier. Numbers were easier. Companies were easier. People complicated everything. A soft cough broke the silence. Then another. Claire straightened instantly. Noah's small body tensed. She reached for a bottle of water and gently encouraged him to take a sip. Ethan noticed the fear hidden behind her calm expression. Most passengers would have missed it. He did not. He had spent years negotiating billion-dollar deals. Reading people had become second nature. This woman was exhausted. Not tired. Exhausted. There was a difference. The kind of exhaustion he saw did not come from a long day. It came from carrying too much for too long. Another cough escaped Noah's chest. Claire looked down at him and whispered something Ethan could not hear. The boy nodded weakly. A few moments later he settled again. Ethan hesitated before speaking. It was not something he usually did with strangers. "How old is he?" he asked quietly. Claire seemed surprised by the question. For a moment, she looked as if she had forgotten he was sitting there. 5, she answered softly. He turned 5 in April. Ethan nodded. He is a tough kid. A faint smile appeared on Claire's face. It was the first genuine expression Ethan had seen from her since boarding. He has to be. The smile disappeared almost immediately. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Around them, the engines hummed steadily through the darkness. Finally, Ethan looked toward Noah again. Is he nervous about Boston? Claire lowered her eyes. Her fingers tightened around the water bottle. When she answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. He thinks we are going there to make his heart stronger. Something inside Ethan shifted. Not enough to understand why. Not enough to change anything yet. But enough that for the first time that evening, he stopped thinking about the meeting waiting for him in the morning and started thinking about the little boy sitting beside him instead. Claire immediately regretted saying it. The moment the words left her mouth, she wished she could pull them back. Strangers were not supposed to hear pieces of your fear. Strangers were not supposed to see how close you were to breaking. Yet something about the darkness outside the windows and the endless hours still ahead had weakened the walls she usually kept around herself. Ethan remained quiet for a moment. Most people would have offered a quick apology or an awkward expression of sympathy. He did neither. Instead, he looked toward Noah, who was sleeping again with one small hand wrapped around the edge of the blanket. He sounds like a brave kid, Ethan finally said. Claire swallowed hard. He is. The answer came easily because it was true. Noah had spent the last year being poked, tested, examined, and questioned by doctors. Through all of it, he had somehow remained kind. He still thanked nurses. He still smiled at receptionists. He still believed every hospital visit was helping him get stronger. Claire often thought he handled everything better than she did. Another hour passed. Somewhere over the middle of the country, the cabin settled even deeper into silence. Ethan tried returning to his work. He opened emails, reviewed projections, scanned reports. Yet his attention kept drifting back to the mother and child beside him. One message from his chief financial officer sat at the top of his inbox. The subject line read, "Final approval required." Ethan stared at it for several seconds. The proposal was simple. Cut funding to several programs that generated little financial return. Reallocate resources toward more profitable divisions. Investors would be pleased. Analysts would praise the decision. The board had already expressed support. It was exactly the type of choice he had made countless times before. Rational, efficient, necessary. He should have approved it hours ago. Instead, he closed the message. Across the aisle, A passenger stood to stretch and accidentally bumped Claire's seat. Noah startled awake. His breathing became faster. Claire instantly leaned toward him. "Hey, buddy. It is okay. You are okay." Her voice remained calm, but Ethan could see the tension in her eyes. Noah rubbed his chest and looked around the unfamiliar cabin. "Are we there yet?" he asked sleepily. Claire forced another smile. "Not yet. How many more hours?" She hesitated. "A few." Noah sighed dramatically, earning the smallest laugh from both adults. For the first time all night, Ethan smiled. The little boy noticed. "Mom says Boston has snow," Noah said. Ethan nodded. "Sometimes. I have never seen real snow." "Then I hope there is plenty waiting for you." Noah seemed satisfied with that answer. Within minutes, he drifted back to sleep. Claire watched him carefully until his breathing steadied again. Only then did she allow herself to relax. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan looked confused. "For what?" Most people stop talking when they hear words like surgery or hospital. Her eyes stayed fixed on Noah. "They do not know what to say?" "I understand. It scares them." Ethan looked down at his hands. "Maybe people are just afraid of saying the wrong thing." Claire considered that. Maybe. Neither spoke again for several moments. Then Ethan noticed the edge of a photograph sticking out from the medical folder beneath the seat. It showed Claire and Noah standing in front of a small apartment building. Both were smiling. Both looked tired, yet somehow happy. Ethan found himself staring longer than he intended. Not because of the picture itself, because he realized something uncomfortable. He could not remember the last time a photograph had captured him looking genuinely happy. The realization lingered long after he looked away. Outside the aircraft, the darkness stretched endlessly across the sky. Inside, thousands of feet above the ground, a decision that had once seemed easy was beginning to feel far more complicated than Ethan Caldwell had ever expected. The digital clock on the cabin screen showed that nearly half the journey remained. Most passengers were asleep now. Blankets covered shoulders. Reading lights glowed like distant stars throughout the darkened aircraft. Claire should have been resting too. Instead, she sat awake listening to every breath Noah took. Mothers learned to measure time differently when their children were sick. Minutes became heartbeats. Hours became worries. She carefully checked the watch clipped to her bag and then glanced at Noah again. His face looked peaceful for the moment. That alone felt like a gift. Ethan noticed she had not slept once since takeoff. "You should try to get some rest," he said quietly. Claire gave a tired smile. "I will after Boston." Ethan almost pointed out that Boston was still hours away, but something told him she was not talking about the flight. She was talking about the operation, the appointment, the outcome waiting at the end of this journey. Rest belonged to some future version of herself, not the woman sitting here tonight. A flight attendant approached carrying a tray. "Compliments of another passenger," she said softly, setting down a cup of hot tea and a small sandwich. Claire looked confused. There must be a mistake. The flight attendant smiled. "No mistake." Her eyes briefly shifted toward Ethan before she continued down the aisle. Claire looked at the food and then at Ethan. "You did not have to do that. You have not eaten since we boarded." "How would you know?" "Because every time food came by, you looked at Noah first and yourself second." Claire lowered her eyes. The observation felt uncomfortably accurate. After a moment, she picked up the tea. The warmth against her hands felt wonderful. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan simply nodded. For reasons he could not explain, the gratitude in her voice affected him more than any business award ever had. Several minutes later, Noah stirred again. His eyes blinked open slowly. "Mom, I am right here. Can I ask something?" "Of course." Noah looked toward Ethan. "Is he your friend?" Claire froze. Ethan looked equally surprised. Then Noah smiled sleepily before either adult could answer. "He seems nice." Ethan actually laughed, a quiet sound he barely recognized as his own. "That might be the nicest performance review I have ever received," he said. Noah grinned. "What is a performance review?" Claire laughed softly for the first time all night. The sound transformed her face. Ethan realized she looked younger when she smiled. Less burdened, less exhausted. For a brief moment, she looked like someone who had not spent months carrying the weight of uncertainty alone. Noah slowly sat up and stared through the dark airplane window. There was nothing visible outside except black sky. "Do you think Boston will help me?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Claire's expression tightened. Ethan saw her searching for the right words. The safe words. The hopeful words. Before she could answer, Noah continued. I know something is wrong with my heart. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Children always knew more than adults realized. Boston has some very good doctors, she said carefully. The best. Noah nodded. Then I think it will be okay. Ethan looked at the boy in silence. The confidence sounded so simple, so innocent, yet it landed harder than any boardroom speech he had heard in years. His phone vibrated. Another message from his executive team. He glanced down. The subject line was impossible to ignore. Funding reduction approval needed before arrival. Ethan stared at the screen. One tap. That was all it would take. One tap, and the decision would be finalized. Profits would increase. Investors would celebrate. Analysts would call it smart leadership. Yet for the first time since the proposal had crossed his desk, he found himself wondering about the faces behind those numbers. The children. The parents. The flights taken with borrowed money and desperate hope. Slowly, he locked the screen without responding. Across the aisle, everyone remained asleep, unaware that somewhere 35,000 feet above the ground, a decision that had seemed purely financial was beginning to feel deeply personal. The cabin lights brightened slightly as the flight crossed into the early hours of the morning. Somewhere below them, cities slept beneath scattered clouds, but inside row 34, sleep still refused to come. Claire checked Noah's forehead again. It had become a habit she could not break. Every few minutes her hand drifted there without thinking, searching for reassurance. Noah seemed comfortable for now. That was enough. Ethan watched quietly from beside them. He had spent most of his adult life believing every problem could be solved through analysis. Gather information. Evaluate risks. Make the logical choice. The formula had built companies, created wealth, and earned respect. Yet nothing about the mother and child beside him fit neatly into a spreadsheet. His phone vibrated once more. Another message from his executive team. This time it was followed by 3 more. He opened the thread. The board wanted confirmation before the market opened. Investors were expecting the announcement. Public relations teams had already prepared statements. Everything was ready. All they needed was his approval. Ethan stared at the screen. Then he looked toward Noah. The boy had fallen asleep again, his head resting against Claire's shoulder. One small hand still clutched the edge of the blanket. A child trusting tomorrow would arrive. Ethan slowly set the phone face down. Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman who had been watching them for part of the flight smiled warmly at Claire. You have a wonderful little boy, she whispered. Claire smiled politely. Thank you. He seems very brave. Claire looked down at Noah. He teaches me how to be brave every day. The woman nodded before returning to her book. The brief exchange left Claire unexpectedly emotional. For months, she had felt invisible. Hospitals had become routine. Financial struggles had become routine. Fear had become routine. People often noticed the illness. Few noticed the mother carrying it. Ethan noticed. How long have you been doing this alone? He asked quietly. Claire knew exactly what he meant. She looked toward the dark window before answering. Since Noah was born, there was no bitterness in her voice. Only exhaustion. His father left? Ethan asked gently. Claire nodded. He was not a bad person. Just someone who was not ready to stay. Ethan remained silent. At first I kept thinking he would come back, Claire continued. Then I realized I was spending energy waiting for someone who had already made his choice. She gave a small shrug. After that, it was just me and Noah. Ethan looked down. Something about the simplicity of those words hit harder than a dramatic story ever could. Just me and Noah. No complaints. No self-pity. Just a fact. Claire opened her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn from being handled so often. Ethan noticed several names written across it in different handwriting. What is that? He asked. Claire smiled softly. A list. Of what? People who helped us get here. Ethan studied the paper. My co-workers. 2 neighbors. A church volunteer. Noah's teacher. A retired nurse from our apartment building. Her finger traced the names carefully. Every person on this list gave something. Some gave money. Some gave time. One woman watched Noah. So I could work extra shifts. She looked down at the paper as though it were something priceless. I promised myself I would never forget any of them. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent years reading reports filled with numbers measured in millions and billions. Yet this piece of paper felt more important than most of the documents he reviewed in a year. Claire carefully folded it again and slipped it back into her bag. When things get hard, she said quietly, I look at that list and remember that there are still good people in the world. Ethan looked away before she could see his expression, because for the first time in a very long time, he found himself wondering whether he was still one of them. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The steady hum of the aircraft filled the silence while most of the cabin remained asleep. Ethan found himself staring at the dark screen of his phone. He could still see the message waiting behind it. Funding reduction approval needed before arrival. Normally, he would have responded immediately. Delays created uncertainty. Uncertainty created problems. That had always been his philosophy. Yet tonight, he could not bring himself to touch the screen. Noah shifted in his seat and slowly opened his eyes again. This time he looked more awake than before. He blinked toward Ethan. "Are you traveling for work?" he asked. Claire looked embarrassed. "Noah, you do not have to ask people personal questions. It is okay," Ethan said with a faint smile. "Yes, I am traveling for work." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "My mom works a lot too." Ethan glanced at Claire. She laughed softly. "Apparently, everyone knows that except me." "You come home tired," Noah said matter-of-factly. "Sometimes you fall asleep on the couch." Claire covered her face for a second. "Thank you for sharing that with the entire airplane." Noah grinned. Ethan laughed quietly. The conversation felt strangely normal. For a few moments there were no hospitals, no business decisions, no fear waiting at the end of the flight. Just three people talking in the middle of the night. Then Noah looked down at the medical folder beneath the seat. "Mom says, Boston is our miracle city." Claire froze. Ethan noticed it immediately. "That is a lot of pressure for one city," he said gently. Noah shrugged. "Not really. The doctors there called us." Ethan looked toward Claire. She hesitated before speaking. "We were on a waiting list for months." Her voice remained calm, but he could hear the emotion beneath it. "There are children from all over the country trying to get appointments. We almost did not make it." "What changed?" Ethan asked. Claire looked down at her hands. "A charitable medical fund approved part of the treatment costs." Ethan felt his heartbeat slow. "A fund?" "Yes." Claire nodded. "Without it, I never could have afforded any of this." She smiled faintly. "I still do not know who created it. I only know that someone I will probably never meet decided children like Noah mattered." Ethan looked away toward the dark cabin. Something uncomfortable settled in his chest. Because he knew exactly which fund she was talking about. And he knew exactly what was scheduled to happen to it in less than 12 hours. Claire continued speaking, unaware of the impact every word was having. "The woman who called me from the hospital started crying when she told us we had been approved." Claire laughed softly at the memory. "Then I started crying. Then Noah started crying because he thought everyone else was crying." Noah smiled proudly. "I was helping." "You were," Claire agreed. Ethan remained silent. The fund had existed for years inside one of his company's healthcare divisions. When advisors proposed eliminating it, the recommendation seemed logical. The program cost millions every year. Direct financial returns were minimal. Investors wanted efficiency. Boards wanted growth. No report had mentioned a mother working extra shifts at a hospital. No report had mentioned a little boy calling Boston his miracle city. Numbers never told stories like that. Another vibration came from Ethan's phone. Then another. Then another. Claire glanced toward it. "Someone seems determined to reach you." Ethan picked up the device. The newest message came from his chief financial officer. "Board approval secured. Awaiting your final authorization." Ethan stared at the words. For years he had believed leadership meant making hard decisions regardless of emotion. Tonight he was beginning to wonder whether true leadership required something entirely different. Across the aisle, passengers continued sleeping peacefully. No one noticed the battle taking place behind the calm expression of the man in seat 34A. No one except perhaps Claire, who watched him for a moment before quietly returning her attention to Noah. And for reasons Ethan could not fully explain, that felt like the moment everything truly began to change. The aircraft had been in the air for nearly 10 hours when the first sign of trouble appeared. Noah had fallen asleep again, his head resting against Claire's arm, but this time his breathing sounded different. Not alarming, not dramatic, just different enough that a mother noticed immediately. Claire straightened in her seat. Her hand moved gently to his shoulder. "Noah," she whispered. His eyes opened slowly. He looked tired, more tired than before. "Hey, buddy, how are you feeling?" Noah forced a small smile. "Okay." The answer came too quickly. Claire felt her stomach tighten. Children often hid discomfort because they did not want to worry the people they loved. Noah had become especially good at it. Ethan noticed the change in her expression. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. Claire nodded at first. Then she stopped herself. Pretending had become such a habit that honesty sometimes felt unnatural. "I am not sure," she admitted. Noah shifted slightly and rested a hand against his chest. The movement lasted less than a second, but both adults saw it. Ethan immediately pressed the call button above their seats. Within moments, a flight attendant arrived. Her calm smile faded when she saw Claire's face. "Is there anything we can help with?" she asked softly. Claire explained Noah's condition and the medication schedule. The attendant listened carefully and offered water, extra blankets, and assistance if needed. Her kindness helped, but it did not erase the fear building inside Claire. Several nearby passengers had begun paying attention. Most looked concerned. One older man across the aisle offered an encouraging smile. Another passenger quietly handed over a small stuffed airplane that had been purchased in the airport gift shop. "For your co-pilot," she said. Noah smiled and accepted it. Claire felt tears threatening again. Sometimes kindness arrived from unexpected places. As the flight attendant left, Ethan stared out the window for several seconds before looking back toward Claire. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "What made you keep going?" Claire looked surprised. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated. "The appointments. The waiting. The uncertainty. Most people would have broken under that kind of pressure." Claire looked down at Noah. Her answer came without hesitation. "Because he never stopped believing we would get here." Ethan followed her gaze. Noah was holding the toy airplane now, studying it as if it were something priceless. Every time another doctor said we needed to wait longer, he would ask me what Boston looked like. Every time a bill arrived, he would tell me things were going to work out. She smiled sadly. Children are strange like that. They lend us their hope when we run out of our own. Ethan felt those words settle heavily in his chest. Children lend us their hope when we run out of our own. He repeated the sentence silently. Then his phone vibrated again. This time he opened the message. A document appeared on the screen. The projected savings from eliminating the medical fund. The numbers were impressive. Tens of millions of dollars. Improved margins. Increased shareholder value. The recommendation ended with a simple line. Final executive approval required. Ethan stared at the screen. Then he looked at Noah. Then at Claire. Then back at the numbers. For the first time, he noticed what was missing from the report. There were no names. No stories. No frightened mothers sitting awake through 14-hour flights. No children calling a city their miracle. The numbers were accurate. Yet somehow they felt incomplete. Ethan locked the phone and slipped it into his pocket. He was not ready to make the decision yet. But for the first time since boarding the aircraft, he knew with absolute certainty that when the moment came, he would never look at that proposal the same way again. The first hint of dawn appeared along the horizon several hours later. Through a narrow gap in the window's shade, a thin band of pale orange light stretched across the sky. Most passengers were beginning to wake. Seatbacks lifted. Reading lights clicked on. The long flight was finally approaching its end. Claire should have felt relieved. Instead, her anxiety grew stronger with every passing minute. Boston was no longer a distant destination. It was becoming real. The hospital was becoming real. The answers waiting there were becoming real. Noah sat quietly beside her, watching the sunrise. The toy airplane remained clutched in his hand. "It looks like the sky is waking up," he said softly. Claire smiled. "I think it is." Ethan listened without speaking. He had spent most of the night thinking about decisions. Some belonged to boardrooms. Some belonged to balance sheets. Some belonged to the version of himself he had spent years becoming. Yet the closer they came to Boston, the more distant those things felt. His phone vibrated again. This time he opened the message immediately. Another reminder from his executive team. Another request for authorization. Another carefully prepared explanation about efficiency and long-term growth. Ethan read every word. Then he opened a second document. This one contained the details of the Medical Assistance Fund. Hundreds of children had received treatment through the program over the years. Thousands of families had been helped in ways no quarterly report could fully measure. He found himself reading individual case summaries rather than financial projections. One child had received a life-changing procedure after a fundraising effort fell short. Another family had been able to travel across the country for specialized care they otherwise could never have afforded. The stories continued page after page. Ethan stared at the screen for a long time. Finally, he opened a new message. His fingers hovered above the keyboard. Then he began typing. The message was brief. Suspend all termination actions related to the program until further notice. Full review required. Effective immediately. He read it twice. Then he pressed send. The response arrived less than a minute later. Questions, concerns, requests for clarification. Ethan ignored them. For the first time in years, he felt completely certain about a decision before hearing anyone else's opinion. Across the aisle, Claire was helping Noah organize the papers in his small backpack. He carefully tucked away the toy airplane. I am bringing this into the hospital, he announced. That seems important, Claire said. It is. It reminds me that I got here. Ethan looked away toward the window. Something about those words struck him unexpectedly hard. It reminds me that I got here. So much of life was spent focusing on destinations that people forgot the courage required simply to arrive. A flight attendant's voice echoed through the cabin, announcing their descent into Boston. Passengers began preparing for landing. Seatbelts clicked. Bags were secured. The mood throughout the aircraft shifted from exhaustion to anticipation. Claire inhaled slowly and looked down at her hands. They were trembling. Ethan noticed immediately. You are scared, he said gently. Claire laughed softly despite herself. Is it that obvious? Only because you have been brave for so long. The words caught her off guard. For a moment she could not respond. Then she nodded. I am terrified. Ethan understood. More than she realized. Because somewhere during the 14-hour journey, her fear had forced him to confront something he had been avoiding for years. The difference between building a successful life and building a meaningful one. As the aircraft descended through the clouds toward Boston, neither of them knew that the most important conversation of the entire flight was still waiting to happen. The wheels touched the runway with a gentle jolt, and for a moment the entire cabin erupted into the familiar sounds of arriving passengers. Seatbelts clicked open. Overhead bins opened. Phones reconnected to networks. Yet Claire barely noticed any of it. Her attention remained fixed on Noah. They had made it to Boston, the city that had lived in their conversations for nearly a year was finally outside the window. Noah pressed his face against the glass and smiled. We are here, Mom. Claire swallowed hard and nodded. We are here. As passengers slowly began leaving their rows, Ethan remained seated. He watched Claire gather her documents, medications, and the carefully folded list of names she carried everywhere. The paper slipped from her hand for a moment. Ethan picked it up and handed it back. Claire smiled. Thank you. Ethan looked at the list one last time. Do not lose that. I never will. Noah stood between them holding his toy airplane. Are you going to your work now? He asked Ethan. Ethan smiled. Eventually. Noah nodded, as if considering something important. Then he extended the toy airplane toward him. You can borrow this if you get scared. Claire covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Ethan stared at the small toy for several seconds before accepting it. That is very generous of you. It helps people be brave, Noah explained. Ethan felt an unexpected lump rise in his throat. I think you might be right. The line of passengers began moving again. Claire adjusted her bag and prepared to leave. Thank you for everything, she said sincerely. The tea, the food, talking to Noah. Ethan stood as well. You do not owe me thanks. Claire shook her head. Kindness always deserves thanks. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a business card. If you need anything while you are in Boston, call this number. Claire accepted it politely, expecting another ordinary contact card. Then she looked down. Her eyes widened. She read the name once. Then again. Ethan Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer. Caldwell Health Systems. The color drained from her face. Wait. Ethan nodded. There was no point pretending anymore. Claire looked from the card to the man beside her. You are Ethan Caldwell? Yes. She stared at him in disbelief. The company that funds the children's treatment program? Ethan took a slow breath. Yes. Claire's eyes filled instantly. Then you are the reason Noah got approved. Ethan shook his head. No. People much better than me made. That happened. He hesitated before continuing. But I almost made a decision that would have prevented families like yours from receiving help in the future. Claire looked confused. Ethan glanced at Noah before lowering his voice. Yesterday, before boarding this flight, I intended to shut the program down. Silence filled the space between them. What changed? Claire asked softly. Ethan looked at Noah. then at the folded list in Claire's hand, then back at her. A mother who never stopped fighting. A little boy who never stopped believing. And 14 hours that reminded me what numbers cannot measure. Claire's eyes overflowed with tears she no longer tried to hide. Ethan continued. The program is staying. Not temporarily. Permanently. In fact, when I land at my office this morning, I am expanding it. Claire stared at him as if she could not fully process the words. Behind her, passengers continued moving through the aisle, completely unaware that a life-changing conversation was taking place. Noah looked up. Does that mean more kids can come to Boston too? Ethan smiled. Yes, that is exactly what it means. Noah grinned. Good. Such a simple answer. Such a simple heart. Ethan laughed quietly. Good, he agreed. Minutes later, they stood near the terminal exit. Hospital staff had arrived to meet Claire and Noah. Before leaving, Noah ran back and wrapped both hands around the toy airplane still tucked into Ethan's palm. Keep it, he said. You might need it more than me. Ethan looked down at the small plastic airplane. Then he looked at the boy. I will keep it. Claire and Noah disappeared into the crowd a few moments later. Ethan remained standing there long after they were gone. Around him, thousands of travelers hurried toward meetings, connections, and destinations. But for the first time in years, he was not thinking about where he was going. He was thinking about who he wanted to become. Because sometimes the most important journey is not the one that crosses a continent. It is the one that carries a person back to the part of themselves they thought they had lost.